welcome to Inside Personal Growth Podcast. Deep dive with us as we unlock the secrets to personal development, empowering you to thrive. Here, growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Tune in, transform, and take your life to the next level by listening to just one of our podcasts. Well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Boyson, the host of Inside Personal Growth. And that young man on the other side of the screen, for all of you who don't know who he is Ken Wilber. And Ken has been on Inside Personal Growth several times before, but the last one was all the way back in 2017 for a book called The Religion of Tomorrow, which I really loved that interview because it kind of really stirred me up and got me thinking about where is all this going. Good day to you, Ken. How are you doing?
I'm fine. I sort of knocked the tooth out here in case you notice a funny look to my smile. But other than that, I'm doing fine.
Well, you know what? People hit their shins on bedposts, people knock their teeth out, people fall down. But I didn't even really notice it. So there you go. Now everybody's going to look at your mouth and go, hey, Ken Wilber knocked a tooth out. But I'm going to let my listeners know a tad about you. Ken is a visionary thinker and inspired genius, is the developer of what's called the integral or the theory of everything, embracing the truths of all the world's great traditions. He is the author of over 20. He just told me it's more than 20. It's 35 books. And we're going to be speaking about his book called Finding Radical Wholeness, A Brief History of Everything is one of his other books, Grace and Grit, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and they go on and on and on. And we'll put a link to his website, which is kenwilber.com. In 2000, he founded the Integral Institute, a think tank for studying issues of science and society with outreach through local and online communities, such as Integral Education Network, Integral Training, and Integral Spiritual Center. And in 2007, Ken co-founded Integral Life, a social media hub dedicated to sharing the integral vision with the worldwide community, as well as documenting and catalyzing the progress of the integral movement. His writings have been translated into over 20 languages, and he lives in Denver. So, Ken, that was a brief introduction. I could have gone on a lot longer than that, but why waste time when we can dive right in to the book, Finding Radical Wholeness? And so, look, you've certainly got a huge collection, and Shambhala has published most of your works, as you had mentioned before. And I go back to the days, it sounds true, putting the cassette CDs of your integral theory into my, I remember the guy who looked like this on the cover. I listened to those so much with the lines and the levels and making sure where I was. So Finding Radical Wholeness, you emphasize the importance of discovering genuine wholeness in our lives. Okay.
Right.
Can you start by defining what wholeness means in the context of your work? Because many of our listeners are going to say, well, whole isn't half.
Right. Well, wholeness means inclusive or systemic or all-inclusive. And the general idea is that on the one hand, it's a series of practices that you can do to actually bring wholeness into your life. And on the other hand, it's sort of a philosophical framework that includes literally all philosophies. And it does this by, when I discovered this framework, I was in my late teens, and I had already had a spontaneous, what Zen calls satori, or an enlightenment or awakening experience.
Was that when you were a dishwasher kid?
Yeah.
As a 19-year-old kid?
Right. And so when you have an awakening or an enlightenment experience, you're usually identified with this small ego or small self. It sort of exists behind your face and looks at the world out there. and you're identified with that, and you might have self-esteem problems, or you might not, but you're essentially a small egoic self. And when you have an awakening experience, you drop that identity with that small self, and you realize you're literally one with everything. You don't look at the mountain, you are the mountain. You don't look at the flock of birds flying overhead, you are the flock of birds. You don't stand on the earth, you are the earth. You're literally one with everything that's arising in your environment. And so if you translate that into conceptual terms, it means that we all have numerous numbers of philosophical perspectives that we take in the world, and there are a dozen or 24 major schools of philosophy in the West and around the world. And what I wanted to do was find how they all could be true, but partial. And so I wanted to find a framework that would hold all of these different philosophical disciplines together. And so we would have empiricism and hermeneutics and idealism and systems theory and so on. And I came up with, well, the way I got onto them was I started noticing that there was a branch of psychology called developmental psychology. And there were famous people like Lawrence Kohlberg and Robert Keegan and Jane Lovinger and Abraham Maslow. And all of them had actual empirical studies of human beings. And they noticed that all human beings, without exception, go through major stages of development.
Right.
And
right.
each of those has a different worldview. So we can use Gene Gebser's names for his major stages. They were archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and systemic, or integral, or integrate. And we all go through as many of those stages as we can manage to grow through as we continue our growing up. And so some people will get to rational stage, some people will make it to pluralistic, and a very few will make it to integral stages of waking up. And as I noticed that of the several dozen developmental psychologists, they each were drawing on a different multiple intelligence that they were measuring its growth. So a multiple intelligence is, most people know we have a cognitive intelligence and we have a moral intelligence, but we also have emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, aesthetic or beauty intelligence, and so on. And most psychologists think there are somewhere between 8 to 12 multiple intelligences that we have. And so what I started doing is on those big yellow pads, legal pads, I would tear one sheet off, and every time I found a developmental sequence, I would write it down on one yellow sheet of paper. And I had over 100 yellow sheets, and I put them all over my floor in my apartment, and the floor was just covered with yellow sheets of paper. And
that's how you mapped it. That's how you mapped it out. You know, as you're saying this, I recall many years ago. I don't know exactly how old you are now, but I'm 70 as of July 3rd. You know, I went to this David Hawkins workshops out in the desert. We were literally in Palm Desert or Palm Springs, and his levels of consciousness, right? Because you really, in much of your work, speak about, hey, well, if the Dalai Lama is here and the average person's resonating at this, and it was power versus force, right?
Right.
And I always appreciated what Hawkins brought out, right? But I appreciated your stuff more because it was more thorough. Okay, it had more meaning to it. In this work that you're now doing, you mentioned that wholeness is not something we naturally perceive. And it's true, because not everybody's had that Sumatra kind of experience like you did at 19, but something we must actively seek.
Right.
Okay, I get that. On the other hand, what are some of the common misconceptions people have about wholeness? Because I think some of us might be experiencing it, but maybe not to the degree that you experienced it. I know that I've never microdosed drugs to actually get there. Although a lot of people would say, hey, well, let's go microdose some drugs because then we can have this more out-of-body experience. What are your thoughts on that, about how we actively seek having this connection and wholeness?
Right. Well, it is a common misconception that wholeness is just lying around and we can see it. I mean, it's just, we look out and we see the whole world and that's a wholeness. And so we're fine. But that's not really true. So you can, for example, I use a typical example is like a Zen student, say 1,000 years ago, and he's not yet had what Zen calls a satori, or an enlightenment or awakening experience, although that is the entire purpose of Zen Buddhism, is to have a satori, or a type of wholeness with everything. But he could be sitting in the woods one day, and he thinks that the sun goes around the earth, and he thinks that the earth is flat. And when he's sitting in the woods, he sees all the trees, but he doesn't see the atoms, the molecules, or the cells in the tree. So he's not really seeing that side of wholeness.
Correct.
And if he has a waking up experience and realizes he's one with all the woods, and he's one with the sun, and he's one with the earth, and that's fine. But he will feel that actual oneness. And that's what we call a waking up experience. But he won't, he'll still think that the sun goes around the earth. He'll still think the earth is flat, and he still won't see the atoms, molecules, or cells in the trees that he's one with. So right there, we can see that there's very important types of wholeness that are just not available to us unless we know specifically where to look.
Well, now look, you have what you call 5 pathways to wholeness.
Right.
You just talked about waking up.
Right.
I think many people get a heightened sense of awareness. The question is how deep do they take that? So you say waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, showing up. Right. These are these 5. So can you explain how these pathways differ and why each is essentially for achieving, quote, big wholeness?
Right.
Because I would have never thought those were going to be the paths, but when I read this, it was like, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah. You mentioned them: waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And the reason that they're all important is I mentioned that I was writing down the developmental sequence on these sheets of yellow paper, and I'd have all these sheets spread all over the floor of my apartment. And each morning I'd get up and I'd just walk and look at them. And I think, now, these have got to divide up in some ways. I mean, they're not all clearly dealing with the same thing, because some of the stages were like archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. But other stages were like foraging to horticultural to agrarian to industrial to informational. Now, those aren't at all the same as archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. And so I started trying to figure out how they all fit together. And after several months of just staring at all of them and trying to figure out how they would work, how they would fit together, I noticed that at least half of them were dealing with subjective or interior stages of growth and development. So that was things like archaic stage to magic stage to mythic stage to rational stage to pluralistic stage, the integral stage. And those are all worldviews that we form in our mind as we think about different types of world. And when we were evolving as a species, we evolved through those stages. We started from archaic, when we were still basically chimpanzees or gorilla-like or ape-like. And then we went to magic. And magic is like voodoo. If you make a doll that looks like somebody and you want to hurt that person, you just start sticking knives in the doll. And because you're just learning to differentiate inside from outside, we think that to change the signifier or the word or the doll that represents this thing, that it'll magically actually change the thing itself. So we think if we start stabbing the doll, it's going to actually hurt the real person magically. And that's what magic is. And a lot of developmental psychologists actually call that stage the magic stage of development. It's very prevalent in 2-year-olds, for example. And they'll think that if they hide under a pillow and they can't see anybody, nobody can see them either because they magically have disappeared. Mm-hmm. And then when we move up to the mythic stage, which is, for example, the whole Old Testament is a mythic statement. And myths are famous for ancient Greece, where you have Apollo, Aphrodite, Zeus, Mars, and so on. And they all live on Mount Olympus. Well, those are all myths. But the thing is, those supernatural beings, we human beings can no longer produce magic, but these supernatural beings can produce magic. And so in the Old Testament, there's all sorts of supernatural miracles and miraculous events. And all these supernatural beings are engaging in this type of magic. And if we want them to do something for us, then we have to pray to them or commit a sacrifice. And by the way, when we first started doing sacrifices, this is about 50,000 years BCE, it was frequently actual human sacrifice. Like everybody's aware of Aztec sacrifice, where they have these big pyramids and they'd walk up the pyramids with a sacrificial victim, stretch him out on a table and cut his heart out, and they'd eat his heart. And then they'd roll him down the stairs, and the townspeople would take his body home and cook it and eat it. And that was all to get
pretty brutal.
Yeah,
pretty brutal. So you use, for my listeners, much in the way of vernacular to describe whether it's mythological or it's an allegory or a story told in the Bible or something, because we're all coming from different perspectives. But I think in this Finding Radical Wholeness, you're finding a common ground. And one of the things that you talk about is being spiritual but not religious. So I want to touch on this, because the waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up, they all relate here. Because how does this approach of being spiritual but not religious help individuals connect with wholeness without the constraints of traditional religious beliefs? Now, I did use the word beliefs, but you got to realize, Ken, for many people listening, it also could be a big T, a truth, not a belief.
Yeah. Right.
We know how challenging it is for people to let go of a truth that they're very, very vigorous about letting the world know that this is my truth. But if they are more spiritual than religious, they're going to be open to radical wholeness.
Right.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
So address that if you would, because it's really...
Sure. The difference between spiritual and religious, I was just sort of introducing those 5 types of wholeness, the 5 different aspects of a radical wholeness. And we were talking about waking up as a type of, you feel one with everything, one with the universe. And then growing up is we actually grow through different stages of thinking capacity or cognitive intelligence. And that means we have different worldviews as we continue to grow up. And as I said, Gene Gebser, who's a developmental genius, called these worldviews the archaic stage, the magic stage, the mythic stage, the rational stage, the pluralistic stage, and the integral stage. The archaic stage is when we're just some 500,000 years ago, when we're just coming out of our gorilla-ness, our chimpanzee-ness, and we are just learning to talk, and let alone learning to think. And that's the archaic stage. And then we move into the magic stage, which is we start to learn to differentiate ourselves from the environment. But because we are not, the mind is not fully differentiated from what it thinks about, then it often confuses the word for the thing that the word represents. Right. And so that gives us a magical, we think if we change the word, we'll magically change the real thing. And that's the essence of magic. As I say, it's very common in 2 to 3-year-olds. And then at around age 5 or 6 or 7, we move from magic to mythic. And mythic, we populate the world with a whole series of supernatural beings, gods, goddesses, nature spirits. And so I mentioned the Greek pantheon of Zeus, Apollo, Mars, Aphrodite, Venus, and so on. And they all live on Mount Olympus. Well, all of those are myths. Now, it's true that when somebody goes through that stage, these supernatural beings are damn important to them. And because they seem very real and they believe in them with their full force of being.
Right.
And that is the source of almost all of the world's great religious mythologies. And I call them religious mythologies because they are mythologies. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a real God or Brahman or Tao or Godhead, because there is. And that's a direct spiritual experience. When I feel one with everything, one with God, one with Jesus Christ, one with Buddha nature. And that's a real spiritual experience. Yeah, but if I just think about it in mythic terms, that's a religion.
Well, do you think, Ken, that I told you at the onset of this that I used to listen to your cassettes, Cosmic Consciousness. It's now obviously on Amazon. Would that be a foundation for our listeners potentially? I think there were 10 CDs in there, but now you can download the audio from Amazon. Yeah, I would highly recommend if people want to get into your work. It's a great entry point as well, because it is available. Obviously, nobody has CD players anymore, but so go download the audio files.
Right.
So the point is that, one of the central themes in the book is wholeness, and you say it's not tied to any mythic or supernatural belief. So let me repeat that. It's not tied to any supernatural belief. So how does this perspective kind of align with broader spiritual movements of today? Spiritual movements. I mean, look, we've got lots of them out there. People aren't groving. They aren't running to go to sign up and be a Christian or whatever. But they are seeking a way to understand their own spirituality.
Right. And all of the world's major religious movements, there are 7 or 8 of them, are Christianity,
Muslim, Judaism, all of those, yes.
Taoism, Buddhism, Vedanta, Hinduism, all of them, including Christian mysticism, have a small but core spiritual experience. And so Christian mystics, for example, tend to be called Neoplatonic mystics because they follow a Neoplatonic view. And Plato, of course, invented the view. And according to him, all normal people are sitting in a cave and the real sun is outside of the cave. But as the sun shines in the cave, it casts shadows of things in the cave against the cave wall. And all human beings are shackled so that we're facing the cave wall. And so we're just seeing shadows of a real reality. And the real reality is the actual sun itself that's outside of the cave, shining its light in the cave and casting the shadows. So all Christian mystics follow that general metaphor because God is the light outside the cave. And if they escape from the cave and break out, they can actually see the real light. They have a direct experience of a real God. And that is a real sun. It's a real God. It's a real Godhead. And Christian mystics, St. Paul, who a lot of the early Christians were having mystical experiences, especially the 12 disciples who were in Christ's presence, because these very powerful gurus or spiritual masters or teachers generally throw out a lot of this energy of oneness.
Well, how would you reference, many of my listeners are going to understand duality, non-duality. You're now speaking about the sun coming in through the cave and the separation between self and this spiritual God or experience or whatever it might be. And, so radical wholeness really is this non-duality. Would that be true?
Yes. Although we find that non-duality itself breaks up into 4 or 5 different aspects of it. And as I continue to discuss them, your listeners will tend to get a sense about what all these 5 different areas are that together add up to a radical wholeness. And so we've talked about waking up, and I'm just introducing growing up. Waking up is just this direct, immediate, first-person experience. First person is described as the perspective of the person who's speaking. So that's a pronoun like I, me, mine. I'm taking a first-person perspective now as I'm speaking. Second-person perspective is the perspective of the person being spoken to. So as you're listening to me, you're a second person. And then the third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So right now, that would be integral theory. That's what we're talking about. And so it's pronouns like he, she, they, them, it, or it's. But
that gives us context.
Yeah.
In other words, if we're looking at waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, showing up, right? It's kind of contextual in the way in which you're describing it, because we're using the English language to frame the framework, because it's the only thing we've got right now. There might be something coming that's different. But I think that, in that previous question about this being spiritual but not religious, I think it's a key thing. And the central theme of the wholeness is not tied, as you said, to any mystic or supernatural belief. but really to align with this broader spiritual movements of today. So let me go back to that question. What, in your estimation, is the broader, more spiritual movement of today? If radical wholeness is the, pardon me for saying this, listeners, but is the Bible, okay? In the sense that, hey, if I picked up radical wholeness, I could change my whole perspective about my life in relation to some supernatural being, whatever it might be. Would you say that would be a true statement?
Well, basically, when you ask where are the spiritual approaches today, as I mentioned, almost all the major religions have two aspects. They're sometimes called an exoteric or an outer approach, and that outer approach is always religion. It's always some form of mythic, literal belief. And developmentalists actually call that mythic stage, from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. They call that mythic stage the mythic literal stage, because the myths are all taken to be real. Zeus is really real. Aphrodite is really real, is a mythic literal reality. But it's still just a myth. It's still up there with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and leprechauns and, whatever.
Agreed.
But you can find if you find almost any of the world's great religions, Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, Christian mysticism, Jewish mysticism, frequently known as Kabbalah, or Sufism, Islamic mysticism, you can find that core of any major religion that is mystical. And mystical means a direct, immediate, first-person experience of a unity. And so you can, some Pentecostal movements put a great deal of stress on being reborn, which is a direct experiential experience of being one with Christ or one with God. So St. Paul said, let this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one. Now, that's a very mystical statement. Let Christ's consciousness replace your self-consciousness, so you're one with Christ and therefore one with everybody, that we all may be one. That's a spiritual, mystical experience. It's real, it's direct, and it's obvious. I mean, when you have a first-person experience, it's apparent. If you're sitting in the woods meditating and all of a sudden you become one with everything, one with all the galaxies and all the stars and the earth and all the planets, and you feel drenched in love and bliss, you know it. It's a direct, immediate, first-person experience. Growing up, which is these different worldviews that we go through, archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, or integral, when you're going through those stages of growing up, you have no idea that you're at a particular stage of development, because a stage of development is more like grammar. It's like a third-person explanation of a worldview, or a third-person explanation of an it, or an it's, or a magic, or a mythic, or a rational, or pluralistic, or an integral worldview. And
so Karen, why do you believe as a species, as the human species, this is an off-the-wall question, but I think appropriate, because understanding all of this as we journey through life, whatever it might be, and as we contemplate our finitude, right? To make a transition off the physical plane into a spiritual experience, whatever we believe is going to happen to us, we're going to reincarnate, whatever that might be. If most of reaching and finding radical wholeness is to help us grab onto a concept or idea that will allow us to explain the afterlife, okay? Because I think in the end, all religions have been pretty focused on, well, here's what will happen to you in your afterlife, right? Whatever that might be. Now, that wasn't one of my preset questions, but it is important, I think, for listeners to say, hey, look, I'm studying all this. I'm becoming quite spiritual. I'm understanding. I think I have a better understanding of what might happen to me. How would you put that in the context? If I pick up Finding, I don't know if you have a copy of the book there, Finding Radical Wholeness, but if I find radical wholeness, is that potentially going to make my transition off this physical plane into a spiritual plane that much easier?
Yes, it will. And
okay.
That's because if you look at the component of radical wholeness called waking up, that's where you ditch your small self, your ego self, and not you, but Christ or Godhead is living in you. And notice the overall number of real Godheads, of real sons outside the cave is but one. And that means your deepest self and my deepest self are the same thing. Yeah. Because when you realize your oneness, you're one with everything. And there's only one of that. And when I realize my oneness, I'm also one with the same everything you're one with. So the overall number of true selves or real selves or big selves or big mind, as Suzuki Roshi called it, is one. Erwin Schrödinger, the founder of modern quantum mechanics, said consciousness is a singular, the plural of which is unknown. In other words, the number of consciousnesses is just one. There's not two. Your consciousness is not different from my consciousness. We both plug in to the same oneness, the same radical wholeness. And that's what we actually are. And that's why we feel one with all sentient beings, one with all living animals, one with all people. And that is a oneness that makes us feel literally at home in the real universe, because we're one with everything that's arising.
Yeah, I go back to remembering as you're speaking about Bohm and the work that he did, and I really, and I know you've read most of his stuff. It really resonates with me. But now here we are in modern life, all of us. Call it modern life, call it what you want. And Finding Radical Wholeness is presenting a vision that integrates spirituality with this modern life. So as a listener on the other side of the screen right now, it's like, okay, these guys are talking about some very complex concepts for me to understand, but how can the readers apply the principles, the two, waking up and growing up, into a daily routine that will help them make this, I'm just going to call it integration, transition. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me give a very simple example that will show you exactly what a non-dual oneness is like.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
And this works for about 50% of the people that I explain it to will get it rather immediately, and about 50% will sort of get it. But it was invented by Douglas Harding, who's a member of the London Buddhist Society. So he's very interested in enlightenment and awakening and a non-dual oneness with everything. And he calls it on having no head. And this is where we either get people that lose.
I hear where you're going.
But Douglas Harding says, notice you can see every part of your body. You can see your toes, your feet, your legs, your thighs, your waist, your chest, your arms, your hands, your fingers. But there's one part of your body you cannot see. You cannot see your head. If you look for your head, all you'll see are two little blobby pink blotches, and that's your nose. but you can't see your head. I can see your head and you can see my head, but I can't see my head and you can't see your head. Right. There's just behind your face, there's just this blankness. But Douglas Harding points out, if you actually look at that blankness, what you'll see is everything that you're looking at. So right now, if you look at your computer screen, you'll notice that because you don't have a head, your computer screen is appearing right where you thought your head was. And it's on this side of your face. And you're one with your computer screen because you don't have a head. And so the computer screen is sitting right where you thought your head was. And the same is true of what's behind your computer screen. You're looking at the wall, but the wall isn't out there. The wall is sitting right where you thought your head was. And if you look at that tree isn't out there. It's sitting right where you thought your head was. And that is the space.
So that explanation is supposed to allow our listeners to understand that it's really integrated.
That's right. That there is no non-dual awareness. And that non-dual awareness is one. Subject and object are one. And they're always one. They're always appearing where you thought your head was.
I understand it, and I hope for our listeners that your explanation, and they can actually go look up, what was the person's name again?
Douglas Harding. And
Douglas Harding.
On having no head.
On having no head. So if you need to go out and get that to right. Understand that better. Now, look, you talk about integral meta theory.
Right.
And to understand the big wholeness, you use this term. Can you break down this concept for listeners who might be new to your work, which there's probably plenty out there that are new to Ken Wilber's work that are listening to this podcast?
Sure. If we take those 5 areas that we're slowly going through, waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up, we've talked about waking up, which is finding that everything is actually sitting where your head was, and you're one with all of it. And that's waking up. And growing up is going through these various and more inclusive types of worldviews. So archaic to magic, the mythic, the rational, the pluralistic, the integral. And each one of those worldviews is more whole or more inclusive. So by the time you get up to integral, you have a very large wholeness because you have a mind that has a worldview that's including everything. And that's why it's called an integral worldview. And then opening up, remember we talked about somewhere between 8 and 12 multiple intelligences. Well, you can actually, when I first found out about multiple intelligences, for example, I didn't know that we had 8 to 12 of them. I just thought, oh yeah, I've got an intelligence. I've got a cognitive thinking, logical intelligence. And that was my idea of my intelligence. But we actually have not just cognitive or thinking intelligence, we have emotional intelligence, we have moral intelligence, we have spiritual intelligence, we have beauty or aesthetic intelligence, we have spatial intelligence. And when I was first learning about these, I would take one day of the week, say Monday, and I would pick one intelligence, say aesthetic or beauty intelligence, and I would just try to use that intelligence all day to just see how could I get a feel for it. And when I first tried it, not everything looked very beautiful, but the more I kept using beauty and looking for beauty, the more I would see beauty, and an enormous number of things started to look really beautiful to me. And then I did.
So how do those intelligence play a role in one's personal growth or spiritual development. You've just talked about these intelligences and the what was the number? You have a spiritual intelligence, you have a outline of
intelligence, moral intelligence.
Right. So how do they play a role for us who are listening in actually our personal growth and our spiritual development?
Well, the point is, each of these multiple intelligences are called lines of development, because if you draw a graph and you put the levels of development, archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral, on going up the scale and drawn out like that, each multiple intelligence is a line that grows through those levels. So we have about 8 to 12 lines of development: cognitive, emotional, moral, aesthetic, spiritual, and so on. And they are each growing through those levels. So in cognitive intelligence, you'll actually have a worldview that goes from archaic, when you're 6 months old,
right,
to magic when you're 2 to 3 years old, to mythic when you're 5 or 6 years old, to rational as you hit adolescence, to pluralistic as you get older and you continue to grow. You'll go through a pluralistic state, and then as you continue to grow, you'll go through an integral stage. Well, that's where your moral stages also go from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. And your beauty stages will go through that, and your emotional stages will go through that. And so when you start to find all of your multiple intelligences and you actually start to practice using each of them, then they'll start to come together into a wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that's an important aspect of our radical wholeness. It includes not only our waking up, not only our growing up, but also our opening up to all of our multiple intelligences.
And it almost seems like at a vibratory level, we are resonating at different levels at different times in our life on all of that scale, right? So if I was to show you even a sound wave from you and I talking right now, you might see it up, or you would see everything, maybe we reach the highest integral level, or we're at a different level. And I think that emotional intelligence is really an important one for this reason. In our current, look, you wrote a book about Trump. You and I did a podcast about it, which is just totally fascinated that we are where we are in this world and that it has become so fragmented and polarized. But I think finding radical wholeness can actually be a way for us to figure out how to put this together, so it isn't confusing. So how can finding this radical wholeness guide individuals to create? I mean, the Dalai Lama always says that, and I have a nonprofit called Compassionate Communications. He says the only thing that's going to solve the world problem is more compassion amongst one another. Now, look, it gets pretty simplistic. That's simplistic as it comes. But the reality is, hey, look, in define compassion, you have to have forgiveness. You got to be grateful. You've got to have a lot of things going on in your life to actually say that I'm compassionate, and that it isn't just empathy, it's true compassion, right? So how do we create more unity and connection in the people out here who are listening, their communities? I know some people took some pretty radical steps. One guy I had on here, he was like, okay, I don't believe what these people do that shoot guns out in the fields, but I'm going to go out there and be with all these guys, and I'm going to get a gun and I'm going to shoot at the target range practice just to see who these people are, right?
Right.
And he found this amazing awakening that they weren't that different.
Right.
As he spoke with them, and I was like, wow, that's pretty cool that somebody didn't feel separate. They were willing to take the step into going to a gun range to actually realize who these folks were.
Right.
Can you speak with us about how we can use this to not be so, pardon me, fucking polarized?
Yeah. Well, what you want to do for a big wholeness is take each of its sections and work on it, practice it. So when we look at waking up, then we want to practice having no head, or we want to practice being one with everything we're aware of. And that's an actual practice. You actually have to do it. And you can do it with a simple analogy of having no head, because whenever you remember you have no head, everything that appears out there will just collapse and be right where you thought your head was. And so you can practice that. And the more you practice that, the more you'll feel a oneness with everything you're aware of, because it's sitting right where you thought your head was. And the more we practice growing up, we can be like at the rational stage of development, and we want to develop to a higher pluralistic stage. Well, pluralistic intelligence is simply, well, I'll preface it by saying rational intelligence creates just unified systems.
Right.
So when you have a rational intelligence, you don't have German chemistry and Buddhist chemistry and Hindu chemistry. There's just chemistry, because it's a rational product, and rationality just speaks out universal systems, whole universal rational systems. When you get to the pluralistic stage, it looks at all the world's different cultures and it says, wait a minute, these different cultures have different types of truth. And which one's right? Well, in a sense, they're all right. I just have to realize they're true, but partial. And so I'll start to take a more multicultural view of the world. And I'll realize that there's all of these multicultural truths, and I have to take all of them into account if I want to have a real view of the whole world. Of course, it will be a multicultural view. And so, but what multiculturalism can't do is it can't draw all of those views into unified whole. That happens at the next stage, the integral stage. And integral stage.
When do people begin to realize to release their biases? At what stage? At what stage would it be that, because a lot of these biases run within people, they don't even realize they're hidden biases, right? At what stage would I have a realization that I'm being biased, and then an opportunity to release or let go of that bias that I'm holding? The integral stage. So you actually have to go all the way to the top of these to remove those biases that we hold.
That's right. And that's to get a real wholeness. And that's why growing up is an important portion of finding a radical wholeness.
So why are people so afraid to release these beliefs, biases, understandings that they carry around, to go into what you're explaining seems to many people who are listening a bit amorphous, right? It's like, oh, wow, I'm going to be in this integral state, and that's where I'm going to live. I'm going to live in an integral state. And it's like, well, can I really live in that integral state, or am I going to like bounce around in between all these lines and levels to really actually reach that? Or at least, you know, I heard it said, it was Joel and Michelle Levy, who've been my meditation teachers for a while. They put a thing out that the Dalai Lama said about mindfulness, but are you really mindful? Or are you really pretending to be mindful? Or something like that he said. And it's like, well, so how do I reach this, incorporate this mindful state in daily routine so that I could live at this integral state, so that I really actually exemplify, right, Ken? Because I tell people, this is a very simple way to do this. If somebody had a video camera of you and videoed your whole day, and then you played it back at the end of the day, would you really like what you saw? right? And if you didn't like it, what would you change? And I think from an awareness standpoint, that creates a heightened awareness for what it is that I need to change to reach the integral state. Would that be a reasonable statement, put in real layman's terms?
Yes and no.
Okay.
When you're going through stages of growing up, there's not much choice. When you move from archaic to magic, when you're around 2 years old, 3 years old, that's not a choice. You don't come out of the archaic stage and say, gosh, I've got to get better, or I've got to get bigger. I know I'll start thinking magically. It doesn't work like that. These are actual determined stages of growing up, and they emerge through a developmental process that's an evolutionary process. And each evolutionary process transcends and includes its predecessor. So, as I say, mythic transcends and includes magic. It transcends magic because it goes beyond to a larger mythic sphere. But it also includes magic because each supernatural being can actually perform magic.
Mm-hmm.
And so the same when you move from magic to mythic, from mythic to rational, from rational to pluralistic, and from pluralistic to integral. So you very rarely get to a point where you go, oh, I'm at this stage and I don't like it. I want to get bigger, so I'm going to grow to a pluralistic stage. Or if I'm pluralistic, I'm going to grow to an integral stage. That doesn't usually happen. As you interact with the world and you continue to get all this feedback from the world, it'll either fit or it won't fit. And if it doesn't fit, you'll start to feel a little bit of cognitive dissonance or a little bit of uncomfortableness. And not that you'll consciously do this, but you'll sort of want to overcome this tension that you're feeling. And that will be the push
for your evolution
to grow.
Right. So your evolution will occur as a result of it. So you actually have to go through these stages to actually ascend to this level. And there isn't a choice. That's what I heard you said.
Right.
Like, hey, I have to experience that to actually get there.
Right.
So you don't get to choose, just I'm just going to go there. But when you have that Centauri experience you had at 19, doesn't that accelerate the process of actually getting there? Because here you are a dishwasher and all of a sudden, you write your first book and it's like, oh, well, but that doesn't happen to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Hopefully I didn't throw you a zinger.
No. I'm just trying to think the simplest way to explain it. That growth process is a very real evolutionary process. And we see the same process occurring phylogenetically as human beings arose from apes and into the first magical beings. Now, when human beings first emerged as human beings, they emerged as magicians because they actually thought that if they changed the word that was signifying a tree, it would actually change the real tree. Or if they had a voodoo doll and they stuck a knife in it, it would actually hurt the person that the voodoo doll represents. And so we lived consciously in magic all the time. But magic is clearly not in touch with real reality. And so we would always feel a little bit of blowback from being so magical. And that would create a tension, and that tension would force us to a higher level of evolution, which happened to be mythic or mythic literal. And so all these gods and goddesses and nature spirits would come into existence. Every stream had a god or goddess. Every mountain had a god or goddess. Every cloud had a god or goddess. And that's how we saw the world. But clearly there are problems with that. because are there real gods and goddesses in nature like that? Probably not.
No.
And we'll give up that notion anyway when we get the blowback from, well, I can't actually find a god in this mountain, or I can't find a goddess in this tree, so I'm just going to drop that. And we moved from those mythic to a rational stage. And that's why since religion comes from the mythic literal stage of development, when we went to that phylogenetically, starting around 50,000 to 10,000 years BC, we started to develop the exoteric religions all around the world. And all of them have some belief in some sort of supernatural being or beings. Some of them are polytheistic. Occasionally, some of them became monotheistic. And the monotheistic religions were ones that actually were introducing greater unity into our developmental sequence. And that unity would be increased when we developed to the rational stage, because the rational stage would find unified, universal systems. So there wasn't Protestant chemistry versus Hindu chemistry versus Buddhist chemistry. There was just chemistry. And it arose mostly in the modern West with the Enlightenment. And we just dropped all of this, oh, there's chemistry for trees and chemistry for clouds and chemistry for mountains. There's just chemistry, and it's the same universally. That's a very rational statement. And then we realized that, well, wait a minute, there's more than just one chemistry, because all these different cultures have their own types of multicultural truths. And we have to start incorporating those. And so we would move into this multicultural stage. And then as we were looking for unity in that, we developed integral stages of development. And that happened phylogenetically. And each time a new stage emerged, it became permanently available to individual humans. And every time a human being is born, they go through the same stages in the same order as we did collectively as a species. So a young child today will go from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic, the integral stages of development. So we're not really choosing those. They're sort of...
that is the kind of the set stage. And the person that did all that work, who is that again? You mentioned their name. I want to repeat it. That came up with that work. That wasn't your work particularly, was it?
No. What I did is I took all the developmental psychologists and put all of their work together on those yellow pads.
But the developmental psychologist that actually came up with that order, you mentioned earlier in the podcast, and I was trying to remember his name.
Jane Levenger.
There you go, Levenger. Yeah. So I think for my listeners too, they ought to go out and look for her book as well, because
yes, but Jane Levenger didn't invent the levels. She didn't discover them. She discovered them as they went through the self sense or the ego sense. So she wrote a book called The Stages of Ego Development.
Okay.
And so ego development is one multiple intelligence that we have. And therefore it's one of those 8 to 12 lines of development that all go through those major levels of development. Now, the words that I'm using for those levels, archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral, those were invented by a man named Gene Gebser. But every developmental psychologist that studied a multiple line, and Maslow studied the needs line, Kohlberg studied the moral line, Piaget studied the cognitive line, they all found the same levels of development. although they give them their own names, of course.
Right.
But they all were going through, because all of our multiple lines of development go through these specific levels of development. And so what I did is I was the first one to pull them all together.
Okay. Yeah, you have worked at such deep levels of trying to help people understand. I think this book, Finding Radical Wholeness, as we mentioned before coming on the podcast, is a seminal work. And it's a work that could help almost anybody enter this space who maybe has not had any exposure to it at all, and really understand what we've been talking about for the last hour and 5 minutes or so. So I want to kind of end this podcast with this. You've got this book that you've created, the Finding Radical Wholeness. We've talked about the stages, right? What do you hope readers are going to take away? And how do you envision the book impacting their spiritual journey? In other words, if they just walk away and they say, oh, I know the 5 paths now. It's waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, showing up. And I've got that. And that's one way for me to easily understand what Ken is talking about. And here is the getting to this point of integral, right? Would you say that you'd like for them to take that away? But what do you really want them to move away where they can actually start practicing something or diving into that would help them find this wholeness?
Sure. Let me explain cleaning up, because it's a very good example of how learning these different 5 main paths that need to be included in a radical wholeness. It's a very good example of the good stuff that can come from learning each individual stream. So cleaning up, what do we mean by that? Cleaning up is generally ascribed to Sigmund Freud and his inner circle. And Freud was a genius, and because of that, he attracted a whole group of literal geniuses to work with him. And he generally had 5 of them in what was called his inner circle. And most people have heard some of these names: Carl Jung, Otto Rank, Salvador Ferenczi, and names such as those. And those were the group of people that together came up with the whole understanding of cleaning up. And when Freud was asked, what does this new psychoanalysis of yours do? He famously said, where id was, their ego shall become. And most people know the terms id and ego because they got them from Freud. But what they don't know, what almost nobody knows, is Freud himself never once used the term id or ego. He used the German pronouns, the it and the I. So he would say, he wouldn't say the id can cause the ego a lot of trouble. He would actually write the it can cause the I much trouble. And his official translator, James Strachey, translated it into Latin, which is it. And he translated I into Latin, which is ego. And he did that because Latin, he felt, made Freud sound more scientific. and so he simply changed that. And all of Freud's books, except one called The Problem of Lay Analyses, are written with id, libido, and ego. But what Freud actually said when he was asked, what does the psychoanalysis of yours do? He said, where it was, there I shall become. Now, that's a very interesting and very accurate statement, because what happens, what Freud discovered, is that people can actually split off aspects of their own mind, judge them negatively, and repress them. out of awareness into the unconscious. And when they do that, they almost always refer to what they pushed out of awareness by a third person pronoun, like it.
Right.
So let's say the anxiety, it overcomes me, or the oppression, I can't control it, or
Right.
my desire to eat, I have no control over it, and so on. So what Freud wanted them to do is convert that it back to part of their I. And perhaps the best of Freud's followers at doing this was a man named Fritz Perls.
Mm-hmm.
And Perls, many people have heard of his name because Perls was a superstar at Esalen Institute. And Esalen Institute was founded by Mike Murphy.
George Litter.
Yeah. And Mike is a very good friend of mine. I just love Mike. But his family left him this gorgeous spot of land in Big Sur, California, right on by the ocean. Now,
well,
that's Esalen Institute. And so Perls would always do workshops there, and he became super famous for doing this. But he would usually at least 100 people would show up for every workshop he did. And he would say, okay, who wants to work? Come on up front. And he'd sit them down in a chair. And then in front of them, he'd put an empty chair. And then he'd say, okay.
Like Gestalt therapy almost.
Yes. And which Fritz Perls invented Gestalt therapy.
Right.
So the person would come up and sit down in the chair. And so Perls would say, okay, what's your problem? And the person might say something, well, like I have this anxiety and it's driving me crazy.
Right.
And so Perls would say, okay, I want you to put that anxiety in this empty chair and talk to it as if it were a person.
Right.
And the person
or move chairs. I mean, it also reminds me so much of what you're saying is the other day, somebody, I'm trying to think of her name, was talking about Byron Katie. And Byron's been on the show many times. But, if you ask Byron Katie's 5 questions, it's going to pretty much do almost the same thing, right? I mean, I've gone through Gestalt therapy because my listeners know that I got a degree in spiritual psychology. And the reality is we studied Carl Jung, we started Perlman, all of them, right? All the greats. And I have seen amazing transformation in people's lives by doing Gestalt therapy, just like what you were talking about. Put it in the chair, talk to it, understand whether it was my father that I had issues with or my mother, go in the chair and pretend that's who's in the chair. And it Perls famously said, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes. And the joke is, even his critics who hated him tended to agree. Perls was just a master of neurosis. And so when you put the anxiety in the empty chair, and then you say, okay, talk to it. So the person would say, okay, why are you doing this to me? And the person would say, okay, now you sit in the empty chair and you become the anxiety and answer. You just asked yourself a question, why are you doing this to me? So answer as the anxiety. And so the person would say, well, because you're stupid and you're dumb and you always mess stuff up. And so I just love to chew your ass out. And then you say, okay, now sit back again and answer as that. And so they go back and forth. And he'd actually get them involved in a conversation. Well, a conversation uses first person and second person, and then what they're talking about, third person. Well, the it starts out as a third person. It is a third person pronoun. Mm-hmm. And so as the person would play the it and talk to it as their I, so they're going to say, well, I'm doing this to you because you're stupid or you're an idiot or so on. Everybody in the audience could see in about 10 or 15 minutes that the person's anxiety was dramatically diminishing. And it was diminishing because they were re-identifying with that it, identifying it as an I. And so where it was, their I shall become. And that was the brilliance of Freud. And Perls was a genius himself. Well, and you've contributed so much to this space that it's truly phenomenal, the works you've done. 35 books, as you said. Look, for everybody out there listening, I want you to go get a copy. I don't have a copy yet. I know that Colin or Andrew is going to send me one, but the reality is that it's called Finding Radical Wholeness. You can get it now. We'll have a link to it on Amazon. You also can go to kenwilber.com as well. That's another place where you can learn more about Ken and his works, the integral theory, and those kind of things. Ken, again, it's been an honor having you back on again to address our listeners and our viewers, for both the ones that participate on YouTube as well. And I think that while we did bounce around a lot, I'm hoping everybody who's listened to this podcast really got a flavor and a feel for what Finding Radical Wholeness could do. It is an entry point book. It's an easier book for you to understand. It's a way for you to move to spirituality, potentially from somebody who's confused by maybe a religious practice. It's an opportunity for you to explore new ways of being whole. Maybe you haven't had that experience of oneness or wholeness yet, but through some of the things you're going to learn, you can get there. And again, Ken, thanks for being on. Namaste to you. Appreciate you and your whole staff for setting this up. Colin and Andrea, thanks so much to all of you guys for giving us this opportunity to put you back on Inside Personal Growth.
Do you have another 10 minutes?
I have another few minutes, but yeah, go.
Okay. Because you asked me how could somebody use this in daily life and how is it going to help them find a wholeness? And I said, let me tell you about cleaning up, because they'll be able to see how when they start to understand cleaning up, you understand a couple of general things. And again, the way you get to a big radical wholeness is you learn each of the 5 aspects of that radical wholeness, and then they'll start to combine when you learn each of them individually. And with cleaning up, the first things you learn is that almost everything in the environment that bothers you is some aspect of yourself that you've sealed off, repressed, and projected. And so if you have a boss you think is too over-controlling and it just drives you crazy, it's because you yourself have some over-controlling tendencies and you've repressed them and projected them onto your boss. Now, he might also be over-controlling, but now he's got 2 over-controlling drives. He's got his own and he's got all of yours. And so, of course, that double whammy is you're gonna hate it, and you're gonna hate your boss. And that's just an example of how everything in your environment that upsets you is a shadow projection. In other words, you take some material, you seal it off as shadow, and you project that shadow onto other people or things or events, and it drives you crazy because it's going to come back at you because you're its source.
Right.
So,
and people have to awaken to, you talk about opening up. You've got to awaken to really understand that that's what you're doing. So many people are unconscious of that actual act. Right. I mean, you're talking about it. So cleaning up, getting to the stages of cleaning up is like, hey, I've gone through awareness. I've gone to opening up. I've gone to growing up. I've gone through the stages that you were talking about so I could really even get to a point of cleaning up, because the reality is they're not going to get to cleaning up unless they have those other stages they go through first. So
that's right.
And you've really articulated it quite well in the book. And again, a pleasure having you on, a pleasure to speak with you again and really get our listeners exposed to this. Go out, get a copy of the book, explore what's in between the pages. Go to Ken's website. You can look at some of his other books as well. There's many of them. We'll put links to the other podcasts as well on this blog entry. But again, Ken, you certainly are somebody that the world needs to listen to more. And hopefully what you take away today is that you're going to go through these stages. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself lots of self-love. Honor and respect who you are. And also, use some forgiveness in the whole process. Forgiveness for what you may have done. Forgiveness for what other people did to you. And be conscious of that. Thanks so much, Ken.
You bet, buddy. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast on Inside Personal Growth. We appreciate your support. And for more information about new podcasts, please go to InsidePersonalGrowth.com or any of your favorite channels to listen to our podcast. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.